The moment Dorothy Brooks stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, the wind tore the hat clean off her head and sent it tumbling down the dusty main street like it was trying to escape the same fate she feared she had ridden straight into. She chased it 3 full steps before a large, sun-browned hand reached down from atop a gray horse and plucked the battered thing right out of the air with the casual ease of a man who caught things for a living. The cowboy held it out to her without looking directly at her, his dark eyes fixed somewhere over her head as though she were not worth the trouble of a proper glance, and Dorothy snatched it back with more force than she intended. "Thank you," she said, putting every ounce of dignity she still possessed into those 2 words. He said, that was all. One syllable, barely audible over the Kansas wind, and then he turned that gray horse around and rode back up the main street of Caldwell without so much as tipping his hat. Dorothy stared after him and felt the particular kind of fury that lives in the chest of a woman who has traveled 900 miles from St. Louis on a stagecoach with a broken seat spring, and is now being dismissed by a man on a horse who could not be bothered to form a complete sentence. She turned back to collect her 2 trunks from the driver and told herself she was not going to think about him again. She thought about him all the way to the boarding house. Her name was Dorothy Brooks, and she was 24 years old, and she had come to Caldwell, Kansas on the strength of a letter she had written and a reply she had received. She was a school teacher by training and by vocation, and the town of Caldwell had placed a notice in the St. Louis Dispatch the previous winter, advertising for a schoolmistress willing to relocate to the frontier territories. Dorothy had answered that notice on a gray January morning when the sleet was coming sideways against the window of the cramped little room she rented above a hat shop, and she had answered it honestly. She had her certificate. She had 5 years of classroom experience. She had no family holding her in Missouri, and she was not afraid of hardship. The letter that came back 3 weeks later was from a man named Gerald Aldridge, who served as the town's chairman of education, and it offered her the position at $30 a month plus lodging, beginning the 1st of April. Dorothy had written back her acceptance before the ink of his letter was dry. What the letter had not told her, and what she discovered in the first hour of her arrival, was that her lodging would be the spare room in the home of the town's largest cattle rancher, a man who apparently owned everything within 10 miles of Caldwell's eastern boundary, and who had agreed to provide room and board to the schoolmistress as some sort of civic duty that Gerald Aldridge seemed very pleased about having negotiated. That rancher's name was Henry Boone. Dorothy learned this from Mrs. Aldridge, Gerald's wife, who met her at the boarding house and walked her through the arrangement over tea and shortbread biscuits with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who considered herself the primary architect of good civic outcomes. "Henry is a perfectly respectable man," Mrs. Aldridge said, in the tone people use when they are trying very hard to make something sound more appealing than it is. "He keeps to himself, which you may find to be a quality. He has a large property, the Boone Ranch, about 2 miles east of town. His housekeeper, Mrs. Cora Finch, will see to your meals and your laundry. You will want for nothing material." "And Mr. Boone himself?" Dorothy asked. Mrs. Aldridge stirred her tea. "He is generous with his land and his resources when the town requires it," she said carefully. "He is not particularly generous with his conversation." Dorothy thought of the man on the gray horse, the one syllable, the gaze that had passed directly over her as though she were a fence post. "That will not bother me," she said. "I have a schoolroom to manage. I do not require conversation at home." She believed that when she said it. The Boone Ranch was 2 miles east of Caldwell, and when Dorothy arrived there the following morning in the wagon that Gerald Aldridge sent for her trunks, she understood immediately that Henry Boone was not merely a rancher. He was a man of considerable means. The main house was a 2-story structure built of good timber and local stone, with a wide front porch that ran the entire length of the facade, and a second-story gallery that looked out over a landscape of rolling grassland so vast and golden in the spring light that Dorothy sat in the wagon seat for a moment and could not speak. Beyond the main house there were two large barns, a bunkhouse, a forge, a smokehouse, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that had been carefully laid out in neat rows, and in the middle distance a herd of cattle so large that Dorothy could not see where it ended. Cowboys moved among the outbuildings with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done their work so long it had become like breathing. It was a working world, self-contained and purposeful, and it was beautiful in the severe and functional way that things built for survival often are. Mrs. Cora Finch came out to greet her before the wagon had fully stopped. She was a short, stout woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned severely under a white cap and eyes that were the warm brown of fresh bread and equally comforting. She took Dorothy's hands in both of hers and said, "Welcome, Miss Brooks. I have been waiting for you. Come inside and I will show you to your room." "Is Mr. Boone at home?" Dorothy asked, stepping down from the wagon. "He is out on the South Range with the men," Mrs. Finch said, in the tone of a woman who found this neither surprising nor troubling. "He will be in for supper at 6 o'clock. He is always in for supper at 6 o'clock. Dorothy followed Mrs. Finch into the house and discovered that the interior was as solidly built and well-maintained as the exterior suggested, with good furniture and clean floors and curtains at the windows that, while practical rather than decorative, gave the rooms a quality of habitation rather than mere shelter. The kitchen was large and warm and smelled of baking bread. The parlor had a stone fireplace and a bookcase along one wall that held a respectable collection of volumes, and Dorothy noted the titles with the automatic attention of a schoolteacher and was surprised to find Dickens, a volume of Tennyson, a copy of Darwin's work that was dog-eared at the spine, several texts on land law, and one very well-worn copy of Cervantes in the original Spanish. She did not expect Spanish. She did not have time to think about it because Mrs. Finch was leading her up the staircase. Her room was at the end of the upstairs corridor, the last door on the left, and when Mrs. Finch opened it, Dorothy stepped inside and stopped. She had expected something adequate. A bed, a chest of drawers, perhaps a small writing table. The kind of room a boarder gets when the landlord is fulfilling an obligation rather than extending a welcome. What she found was not that at all. The room was large, with a window that faced east and would catch the morning light, and it had been furnished with evident thought. The bed had a proper brass frame and a quilt that was clearly new, the fabric not yet faded by washing, in a pattern of deep blue and cream. There was a writing desk under the window with a good chair, and on the desk sat an inkwell and a full set of steel-tipped pens still in their paper wrapping. There was a bookcase, empty but dusted and waiting to be filled. There was a small upholstered chair beside the fireplace, which was already laid with wood ready to be lit. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a mirror hung at exactly the right height for a woman. There was a rag rug on the floor in colors that went with the quilt. There were hooks behind the door for dresses, and a wardrobe with cedar inside to protect fabric from moths. It was a room prepared for someone who was expected and valued. Dorothy turned to Mrs. Finch. "Did you do all of this?" "I helped," Mrs. Finch said, with a small smile that said more than she intended. "But the decisions were Mr. Boone's. He wanted it to be right for you." Dorothy looked at the room again. She thought of the man on the gray horse who had handed back her hat without meeting her eyes and ridden away without a word. She did not know what to do with the contradiction, so she set it aside and began to unpack. Henry Boone came in for supper at exactly 6 o'clock. Dorothy had heard him on the porch, the sound of his boots and the low exchange with someone outside, and then the front door, and she had smoothed her hair and gone down to the dining room, where Mrs. Finch had laid the table for two because Henry ate in the dining room when there was a guest, and apparently nowhere else was suitable. She had her first proper look at him in the lamplight of the dining room and understood several things at once. He was tall, considerably taller than the average, with shoulders built by years of physical work and a face that had been burned to a dark amber by the sun. He was perhaps 30, 32 at most, with dark hair that needed cutting by about 2 weeks and dark eyes under level brows that held the specific quality of watchfulness Dorothy associated with men who spent a great deal of time in open country, where things could go wrong without warning. He was not handsome in a conventional or easy way. He was something harder than handsome. He was a man whose face had been made by what he had done and what he had endured, and the result was striking in the way that weathered stone is striking, which is to say you found yourself looking at it even when you intended not to. He saw her and stopped for exactly 1 second. Then he crossed to the table and pulled back his chair. "Miss Brooks," he said, "welcome to the ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said. "It is a very fine property." "It suits," he said, and sat down. They ate the first meal largely in silence, which was not uncomfortable but was extremely careful. The way silence is when two people are paying close attention to each other while pretending to pay attention to their food. Mrs. Finch had made a roast with potatoes and onions and a pot of pinto beans, and it was the best meal Dorothy had eaten in at least 3 months, which she said aloud because she was not the kind of woman who kept genuinely felt observations to herself. Henry looked up from his plate. "Cora is a good cook," he said. "She is an excellent cook," Dorothy said. "The school in St. Louis where I taught, we had a woman in the kitchen who boiled everything until it surrendered and then apologized for it. This is the opposite of that." He looked at her steadily for a moment. The corner of his mouth moved by perhaps a fraction of an inch. It was not quite a smile. It was the architecture of one. Then he looked back at his plate, and the silence resumed, and Dorothy ate her supper and thought that this was going to be a longer arrangement than it appeared. The school was a single-room building on the north side of Caldwell's Main Street, and it held 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 15. And within 2 weeks of her arrival, Dorothy had learned all their names and most of their stories, which in a frontier town were the kinds of stories that would break your heart if you let them. Children who had come west in wagons and lost siblings on the trail. Children whose fathers had died of fever or injury, or simple bad luck in a country that did not forgive mistakes. Children who did their lessons in clothes they had outgrown by 2 seasons, and who walked 3 miles each way in weather that the Kansas prairie produced with total indifference to human comfort. She loved them with a fierceness that surprised even her. She had always liked children and been good with them, but out here something about the scale of what these families were attempting made the work of teaching feel urgent in a way it never had in the city. These children needed to read and cipher and know history and geography, because those things were the portable wealth of people who might have very little else. And Dorothy taught them as though their futures depended on it, because in many cases she believed they did. She walked the 2 miles to school in the morning and the 2 miles back to the ranch in the evening, and sometimes Henry Boone passed her on horseback, and sometimes he stopped, and sometimes he did not, and she learned quickly enough that there was no predicting which it would be. The times he stopped he would offer her a ride, which she sometimes accepted and sometimes declined depending on the weather and her mood, and the rides were conducted in the same careful silence as their suppers, except that from the back of Henry's gray horse she could see the grassland differently, higher up and further, and that was worth almost any amount of silence. The evenings at the ranch settled into a routine. Supper at 6. Then Henry would retire to what Mrs. Finch called his study, which was a room at the back of the house behind the parlor, and Dorothy would read by the parlor fire or write letters or prepare her lessons for the next day, and the house would be quiet around them. And occasionally she would hear from the study the sound of a chair pushed back or the thud of a book set down, and sometimes nothing at all, and she got used to the shape of his presence as a kind of undercurrent below the surface of her evenings, constant without being intrusive. She told herself this was fine. She told herself he was simply a private man, and that privacy was not the same thing as coldness, and that she was not entitled to more of Henry Boone than the roof over her head and the excellent food from Mrs. Finch's kitchen, and the understanding that she was welcome in his house. She was not always successful in believing this, particularly on the evenings when she caught him watching her from the doorway of the study with an expression that she could not decode. And then he would say good night and turn away, and she would sit with the book open in her lap and not read a single word for 20 minutes. It was on a Wednesday evening in May, 6 weeks after her arrival, that the first real conversation happened. She had been sitting in the parlor reading the Tennyson she had borrowed from his shelf, and she had come to a passage that stopped her and made her set the book down and look at the ceiling for a while, the way a good line of poetry sometimes requires. And when she looked back down, Henry Boone was standing in the doorway of his study with his arms folded and his shoulder against the doorframe, and he was watching her with that unreadable expression that she had grown familiar with and still could not interpret. "Tennyson," she said, holding up the book. "I know the book," he said. "Do you know the poem, The Lotus Eaters?" "I know it." She looked at him. "Then you know that part in the 4th canto where he talks about the men who have forgotten their wives and their children and their homes, and he says that the mild-eyed, melancholy lotus eaters eat and they lie and they smile. I always find that very sad. The smiling is what does it." Henry Boone uncrossed his arms. He came across the parlor and sat down in the chair across the fireplace from her with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision he has considered for some time, and he said, "The sadness is that they have chosen it. The forgetting is not imposed on them. They eat the lotus because they want to stop remembering." Dorothy looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They looked at each other across the fireplace, and then Henry said, "What made you come out here, from St. Louis?" "I wanted to do useful work in a place where it would make a difference," she said, which was true. And then, because she was sitting in a warm parlor at the end of a long day, and there was something about the quality of his attention that made honesty feel less dangerous than it usually did, she added, "And I wanted to stop making the same small life in the same small room and waiting for something to change that was not going to change unless I changed it myself." Henry was quiet for a moment. "That takes courage," he said. "Or recklessness," she said. "The two are very similar from the outside." And for the first time since she had known him, Henry Boone smiled. It was not a small and barely there movement of the corner of his mouth. It was an actual full smile, and it changed his face entirely, like a door opening in a wall you had thought was solid, and Dorothy felt something shift in her chest in a way that she decided immediately she was going to be very sensible about. She was not, in the event, very sensible about it at all. The conversation that evening lasted 2 hours. She discovered that he had been born in Tennessee but had come west at 19 with his father and older brother and had been in Kansas for 11 years. His father had died of pneumonia in the winter of his 2nd year on the ranch, and his brother had gone back east after 5 years and was now a lawyer in Memphis, and Henry had stayed. He had bought out his brother's share of the land and bought more when he could, and built the ranch into what it was now, cattle and horses and 11 men working the land year-round. He ran 3,000 head of cattle in a good year. She discovered that he had taught himself Spanish from a text he had found in a dry goods store in Abilene, and had been reading Cervantes for 4 years, working through it slowly, because he felt that a book that had survived 400 years deserved to be read without hurrying. She discovered that he had a thoroughgoing opinion about the ethics of the range wars that were beginning to agitate the territory, and that the opinion was more nuanced and more concerned with fairness than she would have predicted from a man of his position and property, and that he was aware of the injustices being visited on the smaller ranchers and the homesteaders who were being squeezed off land by the larger operations, and that this awareness sat uncomfortably on him. "Does the Cattle Association pressure you to push the smaller operations out?" she asked. He looked at the fire. "They have tried," he said. "I have not cooperated." Why not? Because I know what it is to build something from nothing on land that is difficult, he said. A man who has done that does not make it harder for others to do the same, not if he has any integrity left. Dorothy thought about that for the rest of the evening and for several days afterward. She thought about Henry Boone quite a lot in those days, and she was aware that this was happening, and she was not sure what she intended to do about it. He was still largely silent in the mornings. He was still absent for most of the daylight hours, out on the range or in the barns, or dealing with the business of a cattle operation that was, she was learning, more complicated and more demanding than she had understood from the outside. He did not go out of his way to seek her out or to make conversation or to be, in any conventional social sense, warm. But she was beginning to understand that the warmth was there. It was simply not on the surface. It was structural, the way heat in stone is not on the surface, but is there when you press your hand against it. There was the morning she came down to find a new box of chalk on the kitchen table, because she had mentioned at supper 2 nights before that the school was running low, and she did not know when the supply order would come. There was no note with it. There was no indication it was from him. It simply was there, and Mrs. Finch looked at the ceiling when Dorothy asked about it. There was the evening when one of her students, a boy named Thomas Creed, who was 11 and lived 4 miles out on the prairie with his father and 2 younger brothers, came to the school in the rain after hours to find her because his father had taken a bad fall from a horse, and he did not know what to do. Dorothy had gone with the boy and found his father with a broken arm and a gash on his head that had bled considerably, and she had done what she could, and then had ridden back to Caldwell to get Dr. Ennis, and when she arrived at the ranch that evening, soaked through and muddy, Henry was on the porch, and he had seen her coming and already had the lamp up, and he came down the porch steps without a word and took her horse and told her to go inside. And when she came back downstairs after changing into dry clothes, there was hot coffee and a plate of food on the kitchen table. And Henry was sitting across from her, and he asked about Thomas's father in a straightforward and practical way, and told her he would send 2 of his men out to the Creed place in the morning to help with the stock until the man could manage on his own again. "You do not have to do that," Dorothy said. "I know," he said, and then she understood something. She understood that this was how Henry Boone showed what he felt, not in words, not in the social currency of pleasantries and easy warmth. In things done, in problems solved, in the quiet engineering of circumstances so that the people around him had what they needed. He had done it her first day here with the room. He had done it with the chalk. He was doing it now with Thomas Creed's father and the men he would send in the morning. It did not make him easy. It did not make him open in the way that people talk about when they say a person is open. But it made him, once you understood the language, profoundly and consistently kind in a way that was more real than the performative warmth of people who shook your hand and looked you in the eye and never once did anything that cost them anything at all. She looked at him across the kitchen table and felt the thing in her chest that she had been being very sensible about do something that was not at all sensible, and she said, "Henry." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, and she meant all of it. The room and the chalk and the coffee and Thomas Creed's father, and the 2 months of being given a home in a house that had been prepared for her arrival with more care than she had yet been given an explanation for. He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in his expression that was not quite his smile, and not quite anything she could name. "You are welcome here," he said, and in his voice it sounded like more than a conventional phrase. It sounded like a statement of policy that had been arrived at through serious deliberation, and was not going to change. She went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the Kansas wind move across the grass outside her window, and thought about what it meant to be welcomed by a man who showed his welcome not in words, but in rooms furnished with care and pens wrapped in their paper, and men sent to help a boy's father in the morning. It meant something. She was becoming quite certain of what it meant. The trouble with the cattle drive came in June. Dorothy heard about it in pieces. The way you hear about things in a small town where information moves through conversations at the general store and outside the church door on Sunday mornings. 3 of Henry's steers had been taken, which in ordinary circumstances would be a matter for the county sheriff, but was complicated in this case, because the man strongly suspected of having taken them was Reuben Holt, who ran a much smaller operation 12 miles north, and who had a long and not uncomplicated history of disputes with the larger ranches in the area. The dispute between Henry Boone and Reuben Holt, Dorothy gathered, went back several years and involved a water source on the northern boundary of the Boone Ranch that Holt claimed he had a right to use under an arrangement made with Henry's father before Henry had taken full ownership, and which Henry apparently disputed on the grounds that no written agreement had ever existed, and that Holt had access to adequate water on his own land if he maintained his irrigation correctly. Dorothy did not know enough about water rights in Kansas to have an opinion on the legal merits, but she thought about what Henry had said about the Cattle Association and the smaller ranchers, and she was aware of the particular difficulty of being a small operation in a territory where the large ones could apply pressure in ways that were not always visible. She mentioned this to Henry one evening at supper carefully, because she was not sure she had the right to an opinion about his business and she was not sure he would welcome it. "I know Reuben Holt is suspected," she said. "I want to ask you something and you can tell me it is none of my concern." Henry put down his fork. "Ask." "Is he desperate? For water, I mean. Is his situation that bad?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. "His north pasture has been drying badly since last summer," he said finally. "He has lost stock. He has a wife and 4 children." "Then is it possible," Dorothy said carefully, "that those cattle were not taken by a man with bad intentions but by a man who is frightened and does not know what else to do?" Henry looked at her across the table, and the expression on his face was the one she was slowly learning to read, the one that was not blank but was very still, the way water is still on the surface when there is a great deal of movement underneath. "I have been considering that," he said. "What will you do?" "I am going to ride out to Holt's place in the morning," he said, "and I am going to talk to him. If he has the cattle, he can return them and we will discuss the water arrangement." Dorothy looked at him. "You are going to let him use the water source?" Henry picked up his fork again. "I am going to see what can be worked out," he said, in a tone that was not a confirmation but was not a denial. She did not push it. But 2 days later she heard from Gerald Aldridge's wife that Henry Boone had ridden out to the Holt place, and that Reuben Holt had returned 3 steers, and that there was now an agreement about the northern water source that both parties had put their names to, and that Holt had come into Caldwell looking like a man who had been let up off his knees. Dorothy was thinking about that when she was at the school on a Friday afternoon, after the children had gone home, and she was cleaning the blackboard. She was thinking about Henry Boone, and the way he made decisions that cost him something without making a production of the cost, and she was thinking about the room he had prepared for her arrival with the blue and cream quilt, and the new pens still in their paper wrapping, and she was thinking that she was very thoroughly falling in love with a man who had yet to say a single personal word to her on the subject of his feelings, and she had no idea whether that was foolish or simply the way things were going to go. She set the chalk eraser down and looked at the classroom and decided she was going to do something about it. She had always been a woman who decided things and then acted on the decision before the second guessing could get its boots on, which was a quality her mother had considered alarming and her father had considered magnificent, and she thought her father was probably right. That evening she did not go into the parlor after supper. She went to Henry's study door, which was ajar, and she knocked on the doorframe. "Come in," he said. The study was a room she had not been in before, and she looked around it with the attention she gave to all spaces that told her things about the people who inhabited them. There was a large desk covered with papers and ledgers in the orderly but dense way of a man who worked at it seriously. There were maps pinned to one wall, survey maps of the territory with boundaries marked in different inks, and she recognized some of the lines as the outer edges of the Boone Ranch, and understood immediately that the territory represented was even larger than she had realized. There was a shelf of books, different from the parlor collection, more technical, land law and animal husbandry and hydrology, and a worn almanac from 3 years prior. There was a single oil lamp on the desk that cast everything in a warm amber light, and Henry was sitting behind the desk with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows and his hair falling across his forehead from leaning over his work. And he looked up when she came in, and something went through his expression that was quick and then controlled. "I wanted to ask you something," Dorothy said. She came and sat down in the chair across the desk from him without being invited, because she thought that waiting to be invited to things was how you spent your whole life outside of rooms you could have been in. "Ask," he said. "The room upstairs," she said. "The room you prepared for me, Mrs. Finch told me the decisions were yours. The quilt, the desk, the pens." Henry said nothing. His face was very still. "I want to understand that," Dorothy said, "because you did not know me. You had a letter from Gerald Aldridge telling you the town's new schoolmistress would require lodging, and from that you prepared a room that a person would prepare for someone they specifically cared about, not a room for a stranger fulfilling an obligation. And I would like to know why." The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated badly, if she had pushed at something that was going to push back in a way she would not enjoy, and she held herself steady against the uncertainty and waited. Henry set down the pen he had been holding. He looked at his hands for a moment and then at her. "Gerald Aldridge's letter told me you were a schoolteacher from St. Louis," he said, 24 years old. "That you had answered the town's notice because you wanted to do work that mattered in a place that needed it, and that you had no family in Missouri that required you to stay. He said you were intelligent and capable, and that you had written the finest letter of application he had received, and that you were, in his view, exactly the kind of person this town needed." He paused. "I read that letter in the evening," he said, "and I was sitting here at this desk, and I thought about what it meant to be a young woman alone, to get on a stagecoach with 2 trunks and ride 900 miles into a territory you had never seen because you believed that a useful life was more important than a comfortable one. And I thought about what it would mean to arrive somewhere after that, and find that no one had thought to make a proper place for you." Dorothy was very still. "I did not want that to be your experience of this ranch," he said. "That is all." "That is not all," she said quietly. He met her eyes. "No," he said after a moment. "It is not all." The lamp made a small sound, the wick shifting, and the light moved over his face, and Dorothy thought that there were entire countries in a person that you did not see until you had the right conversation, and that she had just been handed a passport to a territory she very much wanted to explore. "Henry," she said. "Dorothy," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been practicing saying for a while. "I am going to tell you something, and you can do what you like with it," she said. "I came here to teach school. I came here because I wanted a life that meant something. I did not come here expecting to find a man I wanted to know. And I have found one, and it is inconvenient, and I am not going to pretend it is not happening because I have never been any good at pretending things are not happening when they clearly are." Henry looked at her for a long moment with that still, deep, watchful quality that she now knew was not blankness but concentration of a very particular kind. "You are the most honest person I have encountered in a long time," he said. "Is that a quality you find appealing or alarming?" she asked. "Both," he said. "Mostly appealing." And then he did something she had not predicted. He came around the desk and he sat on the edge of it, closer to her, and he said, "I have been trying to determine the appropriate way to say several things to you since approximately the 3rd week you were here." "What things?" she asked. "That I look forward to supper in a way I have not looked forward to supper in a long time," he said. "That when you are not in the house I am aware of your absence in the way you are aware of a fire that has gone out. That I have read the Tennyson again since you mentioned the Lotus Eaters, and I thought about it differently than I ever had because of what you said about the smiling." Dorothy looked up at him. "Those are good things to say," she said softly. "I am not practiced at saying them," he said. "I want you to know that I am not a man who has had a great deal of experience with this kind of conversation." "Neither have I," she said. "I am making it up as I go." The corner of his mouth did the thing it had done the very first evening, but more fully than before, moving toward that door-opening smile. "Then we are even," he said. She stood up from the chair, which put her much closer to him, and she looked up at him in the amber lamplight and said, "I would very much like it if you would show me the rest of this ranch sometime. All of it. I have seen the house and the barns and the cattle, but you have maps on that wall that suggest the property goes considerably further than what I have seen." "Yes," he said, "it does." "Then show me," she said. "I want to see it." He looked at her and something settled in his face, something that had been held in tension releasing, and he said, "Tomorrow morning, after the school day, I will take you out to the eastern boundary where the creek comes through. It is worth seeing in June." "I will be here," she said. She went to bed that night feeling the particular and very specific happiness of a thing clarified, of a direction chosen, of a conversation that had moved something that needed to move. And she lay in the room he had prepared for her, and looked at the blue and cream quilt, and thought that she understood now exactly what it had meant, and she thought it was one of the most quietly beautiful things she had ever encountered. The following afternoon Henry came to the schoolhouse at the end of the day, which caused considerable excitement among Dorothy's students, particularly the older girls who were at the age where they noticed such things about tall men on gray horses. Dorothy dismissed them with a firmness that was undermined by the fact that she was smiling, and she went out to find Henry with the gray horse and a second horse, a chestnut mare, standing ready. "You brought me a horse," she said. "You cannot see the eastern boundary from the back of the gray," he said. "She is steady. Her name is Molly." Dorothy introduced herself to Molly with the directness she brought to all introductions, and mounted with sufficient competence that Henry did not feel the need to assist, which she thought was the right start to any equestrian relationship with a man who worked with horses professionally. They rode east out of Caldwell through the long evening light of a June afternoon on the Kansas prairie, and the grass was high and green from the spring rains, catching the light in waves when the wind moved through it, and the sky was the wide, extravagant blue that you only get on the open plains where there is nothing between you and the horizon to interrupt it. Henry rode beside her and talked more than she had ever heard him talk, which was still not a great deal by most standards, but was, for him, a kind of eloquence. He told her about the land as they moved through it, which parts were good for winter grazing, which draws were dangerous in a flood, where the prairie dogs had their towns and needed to be avoided on horseback, where a small herd of antelope had been wintering for the past 3 years in a hollow east of the creek. He talked about the land the way people talk about something they love, and have been loving for so long that the affection has become part of their grammar, embedded in every sentence. And then they came to the creek, and Dorothy understood what he had meant about it being worth seeing in June. The creek came through a stand of cottonwood trees that were in their full early summer leaf, the pale green of them luminous in the evening light, and the water ran clear and quick over a bed of smooth limestone, and along the banks the wildflowers were everything the Kansas spring could produce. Blue larkspur and orange Indian paintbrush, and the yellow of coneflowers just beginning to open, and the cottonwood seeds were drifting in the still air above the water like a very slow and very beautiful kind of snow. Dorothy sat on Molly and looked at it, and said nothing for a while. Henry pulled the gray horse up beside her and waited, which she had learned was something he was very good at, the particular patience of a man who understood that silence was not empty. "This is yours," she said finally, "all of this." "Yes," he said. "Do you know how extraordinary that is?" she asked. "To have built this out of nothing." "My father and my brother were part of it," he said. "You stayed," she said. "You chose it when you could have chosen anything else. The rest of it was just beginning." He looked out at the water. "I could not have left it," he said, "even if I had wanted to, which I did not." She looked at him in profile against the cottonwoods and the declining sun, and she thought that there was something in a person's relationship to the land they had chosen that told you a great deal about their character. A man who built something and stayed and did not leave when the work was hard was a certain kind of man. She had known that intellectually. In this moment, watching him look at the creek he had kept and worked and refused to abandon, she understood it in a way that moved from her head somewhere considerably more central. "Henry," she said. He turned to look at her. "I am very glad I came to Caldwell," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the evening light was on his face, and he said, "So am I, Dorothy. More than I know how to say." She thought that a man who had taught himself Spanish from a book in a dry goods store in Abilene and read Cervantes slowly out of respect probably knew how to say quite a great deal if he chose to, and that the restraint was itself a kind of statement. She was moved by it in a way she had not expected. They rode back to the ranch in the long dusk of the Kansas evening, and the sky turned from blue to gold to the deep rose violet of a prairie sunset. And Dorothy thought she had never in her life been so purely happy as she was in this moment on a horse beside a quiet man in the wide and breathing country of the American West. And she was going to do everything in her power to make sure it lasted. Summer moved through the ranch like something deliberate and slow, burning off the morning mist and baking the grassland to gold and making the evenings, when the heat broke and the wind came up, feel like gifts. Dorothy taught school through June, and then through a July that was hot enough to make the schoolroom almost unbearable, and she moved the lessons outside under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the schoolyard, and the children were better for it, more awake, more alert, and she thought that education was largely about attention, and that the natural world was quite good at producing attention in people if you let it. She and Henry fell into each other with the gradual certainty of two rivers that have been running toward the same place for a long time and finally reach it. It was not dramatic in its early stages. It was the accumulation of evenings in the parlor and morning rides and Sunday afternoons when she was not teaching, and he was not riding the range, and they sat on the porch in the shade and talked about everything and nothing. Tennyson and cattle prices, and the politics of the Kansas-Colorado border disputes, and what it meant to believe in God in a country that regularly demonstrated its total indifference to human suffering, and also produced sunsets of the kind that happened over the Boone ranch on a clear evening. He made her laugh in ways she had not expected, with a dry and careful wit that was easy to miss if you were not paying attention, which she always was. She made him talk more than he was used to talking, which she gathered surprised him, and which he seemed to find more relief than burden. Mrs. Finch watched all of it with the satisfied expression of a woman whose opinions had been entirely correct. It was on a Sunday afternoon in August that Henry kissed her. They had been sitting on the porch after the midday meal, and Dorothy had been reading aloud to him from a letter she had received from a teacher friend in St. Louis, who described her life there in terms that made Dorothy aware with great clarity of all the things she did not miss. And Henry had been whittling a piece of cedar into something that he said was going to be a whistle for one of the Creed boys' birthdays. And she had looked up from the letter and found him looking at her with an expression that was no longer the watchful and difficult-to-read look of their early weeks, but something much more open. Something that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for some time. She set the letter down. He set down the cedar and the knife. And he reached across and took her hand, which was the most direct thing he had ever done. And she turned her hand over and held his. And then he leaned across the space between their chairs and kissed her, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything. And she kissed him back with the same honest directness with which she operated in all other areas of her life. And when they pulled apart, he was looking at her with something in his face that she thought was probably the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on him. "I have wanted to do that for quite some time," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been waiting with considerable patience." "I did not want to presume," he said. "Henry," she said, "for a man who prepared an entire room for a woman he had never met based on a letter, Presuming is perhaps something you could afford to do a little more often." He laughed then, a real laugh, low and genuine, and she thought that sound was one of the best things she had heard since she came to Kansas. After that, the world rearranged itself in the way it does when something important happens. The walks to school in the morning were different, not because anything visible had changed, but because she carried a different knowledge with her. The suppers in the dining room were different. The evenings in the parlor were different. She sat beside him now rather than across from him, and he read sometimes while she prepared her lessons, and occasionally he would read a passage aloud that he thought she should hear, and she would do the same with whatever she was reading, and the house was quiet around them in a way that was no longer careful but easy. He courted her with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything, which meant he was not always showy about it, but he was consistent and thoughtful, and she received his attentions with the open appreciation that she thought they deserved, and that she could see he had not entirely expected, as though he was not entirely sure he deserved to be appreciated in return. That was something she turned over in her mind during the evenings sometimes, when he had gone to the study and she sat by the fire. What had made him uncertain of his own worth? He was a man of integrity and capability and quiet and enormous kindness, a man who had built something real from nothing, and who conducted himself with a fairness toward other people that she respected more the longer she knew him. Whatever the origin of the uncertainty, she intended to counter it with consistency, with the same steadiness he brought to caring for the people around him. Autumn came in September with a sharpness in the air, and the smell of cut hay, and a sky that turned a different and more serious shade of blue, and Henry asked her to marry him in October. He asked her at the creek at the cottonwood stand, which she thought was entirely correct, and he did it without a great deal of ceremony but with a great deal of sincerity, standing with her at the edge of the water in the October afternoon with the leaves going gold in the trees and the water lower now in the late season, and he said, "I want to ask you something. I have thought about it carefully for some time." She looked at him, then asked, "Will you marry me?" he said. "I know it is a large thing to ask. You have your work here and your students, and I know that this is a life that is not what you came from, and I know that a ranch in Kansas is not the easiest place in the world to build a life. But I want to build mine with you, if you are willing." Dorothy looked at the creek and the gold cottonwood leaves and the wide Kansas sky above the water, and thought about the room with the blue and cream quilt, and the pens still in their paper, and the desk under the east window where she had written 100 lesson plans and a dozen letters and 3 pages of a journal she was keeping, because she thought that what was happening to her out here deserved to be written down. "Yes," she said, without reservation. He put his hands on her face, both of them, with that careful and deliberate tenderness she had come to know as the language of his love, and he kissed her in the afternoon light of the October cottonwoods, and Dorothy thought that she had been right to get on the stagecoach in St. Louis on a winter morning and ride 900 miles into the unknown, because the unknown had turned out to be exactly the right country. They were married in the Caldwell Church in December of 1878, on a day when the snow was coming down outside in the big slow flakes of a proper winter storm, and the whole town came because Henry Boone had been a feature of the landscape of Caldwell for 11 years, and people were glad to see him happy even if they had not previously known, quite, that he was not. Dorothy wore the dress she had brought from St. Louis, the deep blue wool she had bought the autumn before her departure, and which she had been saving for an occasion that had not yet declared itself, and she had done her hair with the pearl pins that had been her mother's, and when she came down the stairs of the ranch house that morning Henry was standing in the hallway looking up at her, and his face did the thing she had learned to read, the thing that was all of his feeling concentrated into stillness, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." "You should have led with that," she told him, from 3 steps above him on the stair, which was the right height for looking at a tall man. "It would have saved us both some time." He laughed, and she came down the last 3 steps and he offered her his arm, and they went to the church in the snow. Mrs. Finch cried. Gerald Aldridge looked pleased in the way of a man whose civic negotiations have produced excellent outcomes. The children of Dorothy's class, the ones old enough to attend without their parents, sat in a row in the back pew and watched with the concentrated interest of people attending a theatrical performance they had been given advance access to. Thomas Creed, whose father had mended well and whose family Henry had continued to quietly assist in the months since the accident, sat in that row with his brothers, and he had combed his hair for the occasion and was wearing his best shirt, which he had outgrown, and he looked proud in the way children look proud when the adults around them do something they approve of. The winter was long and cold, and Dorothy loved it. She loved the ranch in winter with a fierceness that surprised her, because she had expected to find it bleak. The way people in St. Louis talked about the prairie winter as a kind of endurance contest. What she found instead was a world made simple and essential, reduced to what mattered: warmth, food, the cattle sheltered in the winter pastures, the men doing their work, the house full of lamplight and the smell of wood smoke, and Henry, who was a different man in the winter in the way that all working men are different when the frantic pace of the growing season eases and they can be still for a moment. He read more in the winter. He talked more. He had a quality of expansiveness in the evenings by the fire that she treasured, a willingness to range through ideas and arguments, and the kind of big open questions about the world that she had spent her years in St. Louis longing to discuss with someone who would take them seriously. He took everything seriously. He was one of the most serious people she had ever known, and she thought it was one of the best things about him, because it meant that when he was attentive, he was truly attentive, and when he laughed, he truly laughed, and when he loved you, it was a total and considered proposition. She was thoroughly loved, and she knew it with the certainty of a woman paying close attention. Spring of 1879 was different from the spring of 1878, not just because she was now a married woman and the mistress of the ranch in a way that Mrs. Finch seemed to find deeply satisfying, but because she was watching the country she had come to know through a second season and finding new things in what she thought she already understood. The prairie in its second spring was familiar but not predictable, and she thought that was the best kind of familiarity, the kind that still surprised you. She kept the school through the spring, and Henry never suggested otherwise, which she thought was worth noting because, in 1879, the expectation that a married woman would retire from her professional work was fairly standard, and the fact that Henry Boone had no such expectation said something very particular about him that she loved. "The children need you," he said, when she raised the subject one evening to be sure they were in agreement. "And you need the school. Why would anything change? Some people would suggest that being a wife and keeping a house ought to be sufficient occupation," she said. "Those people should manage 3,000 cattle and 12 men and find out what sufficient occupation looks like," he said, which made her laugh until the lamp flickered. In May she realized she was pregnant. She told Henry on a Saturday morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, with the directness that she brought to all things, and she watched his face go through something extraordinary, a sequence of expressions so fast and so complete that she felt she was watching all of the things he usually kept contained pass across his features in quick succession. Surprise and something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, and then a happiness so large and so evident that it changed his whole face and posture and presence in the room. He set down his coffee cup and came around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her for a long time. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am in fact excellent." "Good," he said. And then, "Dorothy." "I know," she said. "Me too." He pulled her close and held her with his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest and felt the steady sound of his heart and thought that there were moments in a life that were so complete in themselves that you wanted to stop time inside them just for a while and hold still and breathe in everything that was true. Mrs. Finch had to be told, of course, and her response was to cook an enormous dinner and set the table with the good dishes and get a little misty around the eyes while maintaining the expression of a woman who had predicted this outcome and was pleased to be confirmed. The baby came in January of 1880, a son, born on a cold January morning with the snow on the ground outside and Dr. Ennis present and Mrs. Finch present and Henry sitting on the edge of the bed with Dorothy's hand in both of his and his face, entirely outside of his usual control, which was the first time she had ever seen him unable to arrange his expression into anything resembling composure, and it was one of the most dear things she had ever seen in her life. Their son was born healthy and loud, and with his father's dark hair and his mother's tendency to express himself without equivocation, which was apparent from the first moments of his existence. They named him James, for Henry's father, and William for Dorothy's brother who had died young of a fever when Dorothy was 12, and whom she had loved more than she had loved anyone in St. Louis. And his name was James William Boone, and he fit in Henry's arms like something that had been made to go there. Henry held him on the morning of his birth, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the baby in his arms and the January light coming in, and Dorothy watched from the bed, tired and happy in a way that was bone-deep and complete, and Henry was looking at the baby with an expression she had never seen on him before and yet recognized immediately. Because it was the expression she had seen on his face the first evening she had sat with him by the parlor fire and watched a door open in a wall she had thought was solid. "Hello," Henry said quietly to his son. "I am your father." Dorothy pressed her fingers to her mouth. She was not going to cry. She cried anyway. James William Boone grew in the way that healthy children on working ranches grow, quickly, and with a great deal of noise and physical determination. He was walking by the time he was 11 months old and running almost immediately after, and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's complete willingness to express every opinion he had formed on any subject, which meant that by the time he was 2, he was conducting a running commentary on ranch life that delighted everyone, including the ranch hands, who called him Little Boss, and took a proprietary interest in his development that Henry observed with quiet satisfaction. Dorothy went back to teaching the school in February, 3 weeks after James was born, because the children needed her, and because Mrs. Finch was more than capable of managing the mornings, and because Henry, to his own apparent surprise, proved to be a man who was entirely comfortable sitting with his son in the kitchen after the morning chores while Mrs. Finch baked and Dorothy taught school, and who read to the boy from an early age with the seriousness of purpose he brought to all reading, including, at one point, a passage from Cervantes that he claimed was appropriate because the language was beautiful even if the child could not understand it yet. Dorothy came home from school one afternoon and found Henry sitting at the kitchen table with James on his knee, reading Don Quixote aloud in Spanish to a 10-month-old baby who was watching his father's face with the intense and serious attention of someone trying to work out a very important problem. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched them and thought that this was her life, this exact scene in this exact kitchen in this house on the Kansas prairie. And it was so much more than she had known to wish for when she had sat in a cramped room above a hat shop in St. Louis on a gray January morning and answered a notice in the newspaper. The years moved as they do when a life is full and the work is real and the love is deep and daily rather than occasional, in a way that seems both fast and not fast but simply continuous, like the creek through the cottonwoods. Henry expanded the ranch in the early 1880s, not by the kind of aggressive acquisition that the Cattle Association favored, but by buying land from ranchers who wanted to sell and by negotiating arrangements that kept families on their property while giving the Boone Ranch access to additional grazing. He was known in the territory as a man who dealt honestly, which was not universal in that time and place, and which Dorothy thought was as fine a reputation as a person could have. The school grew. By 1882, Caldwell had expanded enough that the single-room schoolhouse was too small, and a new building went up on the same street with 2 rooms, and Dorothy hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Clara Webb who came from Ohio and arrived in Caldwell with 2 trunks and an air of determined competence that Dorothy recognized and liked immediately. There were hard things too, because there always are. There was a drought in the summer of 1881 that cost Henry cattle and cost the smaller ranchers around them more, and he spent that summer in a state of practical and focused concern that Dorothy supported with the same quiet efficiency he had always applied to her needs, making sure the house ran well, and the men were fed, and the atmosphere was calm when he came in at the end of a day that had gone badly in the field. There was a winter illness that took hold of the ranch in February of 1882 and went through the bunkhouse and then through the house, and Dorothy nursed her husband and her son and Mrs. Finch through 3 weeks of it while somehow not falling seriously ill herself, which Henry said later was because she was, constitutionally, undefeatable. There were the normal and less than normal difficulties of living in a territory that was still finding its shape, where the law was not always reliable, and the weather was never reliable, and the work was constant. But the difficulties had the quality that difficulties have when you are carrying them with someone who does not flinch, and does not abandon the task, and does not stop caring about the outcome, which is to say they were manageable, and sometimes they made things more interesting, and they always made the good things feel more good by contrast. In the spring of 1883, Dorothy found she was expecting their second child. She told Henry in the kitchen again, because the kitchen was where they had most of their important conversations, and she thought it was appropriate that it continue. He received the news with the same sequence of expressions as the first time, only this time faster, and with a smile already beginning by the middle of them. James William Boone, now 3 years old and very much his own person, was told that he was going to have a brother or sister, and he considered this information for a moment with his father's serious dark eyes, and then said that he would prefer a brother because brothers could help with cattle and sisters only sometimes did. The second child arrived in November of 1883, and she was a girl, and when Henry placed her in James's arms with the careful support that a father teaches a 3-year-old to provide, James looked at his sister for a long moment with an expression that was entirely new on his face, and then he said, "She can help with the cattle when she is older." Dorothy and Henry exchanged a look over the heads of their children that contained an entire conversation. They named her Margaret Louise Boone, Margaret for Henry's mother who had died when Henry was young, and whom he had spoken of to Dorothy in the way people speak of those whose loss has been so long absorbed into them that the grief has become part of their character, and Louise for Dorothy's mother. Margaret Louise Boone announced herself to the world in the same loud and unequivocal way that her brother had, and she grew with the same speed and determination, and within 2 years she was following her brother around the ranch with a purposefulness that would have confirmed his prediction about the cattle if they had been old enough to reach the fence rails. Henry watched his children grow with the same careful and deep attention he gave to everything he valued. He taught James to ride before the boy was 4, on a small pony named Chester who was old and patient, and seemed to understand his assignment. He read to both children every evening, English and sometimes Spanish, and he answered their questions with the same seriousness he answered Dorothy's, which she thought was one of the best things a parent could do for a child. Dorothy taught school through all of it, through both pregnancies and both recoveries, and all the years of children growing and seasons turning, and the town of Caldwell growing and changing around them. She taught children who grew up and had children of their own, and who sometimes brought those children to her school, and she thought about the particular and quiet power of a classroom, all those minds opening to what the world contained, and she was grateful every single morning of her professional life that she had answered the notice in the St. Louis Dispatch on a gray January morning in 1877. Thomas Creed, whose family Henry had helped through those early hard years, grew into a capable young man who went to work for the Boone Ranch at 17 and was one of Henry's most reliable hands by the time he was 20. His father visited the ranch occasionally and had the manner of a man who carried a long gratitude that he could not entirely find words for, and Henry received this with the matter-of-fact grace of a man who did not keep accounts in that direction. Mrs. Finch stayed until 1885, when her own health began to make the work of a working ranch kitchen more than she could manage, and she retired to a room in town with a niece who had married a blacksmith. And the parting was tearful in a way that Dorothy allowed freely, and that Henry managed with a quiet emotion that he did not try to hide. And they found a replacement cook in a woman named Ada who was efficient and kind, and learned to make the pinto beans almost as well as Mrs. Finch had. Which Mrs. Finch, when she heard this, took as both a compliment and a slight. The ranch by the middle of the 1880s was a different place from the ranch Dorothy had arrived at in the spring of 1878, but it was also the same place in all the ways that mattered. The main house had been extended to give the children proper rooms, and to add a second parlor that Henry used as an additional study when the papers and ledgers outgrew the original space. The kitchen garden had been expanded by Dorothy, who had discovered a passion for growing things that she had not known she possessed until the Kansas soil was in her hands. There were more horses now, and Henry had begun a small breeding operation for quarter horses that the cowboys of the territory found excellent for cattle work, and this brought a new kind of activity to the ranch and a new kind of visitor, ranchers from Texas and Colorado, and even from further north coming to look at Henry's horses, and usually leaving with at least one. The territory itself was changing. Kansas had been a state since 1861, but the western counties were still very much the frontier, still in the process of becoming something settled and stable, and Dorothy watched this process with the attention she gave to history in motion, the way a people makes itself out of what it finds and what it brings and what it endures. She was aware, as she had always been, of the injustices embedded in this process. The land that had been taken from the peoples who had occupied these plains for generations, the violence and the displacement, and the erasure that had preceded and accompanied and made possible the world she now lived in. This awareness did not sit easy with her, and she did not try to make it easy, and she talked about it with her students in ways that were honest, and that the more conservative members of the school board occasionally found uncomfortable, and she did not adjust the honesty to make them more comfortable. Henry agreed with her on this, which had been one of the early and important confirmations of her understanding of his character, that he held the same uncomfortable awareness and did not dismiss it. "We are here on land that was taken by force from people who had a right to it," he said to her once in the study, in one of the long evening conversations that were the best part of their marriage. "That is a fact. Being honest about it does not undo it, but not being honest about it is worse. The children in my school need to know it," she said. "Teach them," he said. She did. James Boone was 7 when he began asking questions about the Kansas people who had lived on these plains before the settlers came, because Dorothy had been talking about it in school, and James attended her school like every other child in Caldwell, his mother's son in the classroom as much as anyone's, and he came home with the specific focused intensity of a child working on something important, and asked his father about the history of the land the ranch stood on. Henry sat down with his son at the kitchen table that evening and talked to him honestly and at length, and Dorothy sat at the other end of the table with Margaret in her lap, who was too young for the conversation but present for it anyway, and she listened to her husband explain the history of this land to their son with the care and honesty that the subject deserved. And she thought that the room prepared for her on her first day at the ranch was not the only room Henry Boone had ever made ready for someone he loved. The whole life he had built here was a kind of room, furnished with thought and care, and the intention of making a place where people could be genuinely well. That was what she had understood on the day she first saw it, even before she could have articulated it. The room had been the first evidence of the man, the clearest expression of who he was before she knew him well enough to read the subtler evidence. A man who prepared a room like that was a man who thought about what other people needed and then quietly made it available, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply because it was the right thing to do. She had thought in her first weeks at the ranch that he was distant and cold, because the surface did not show what was underneath. She had been wrong about the distance, and she had been wrong about the cold, and she was glad every day that she had been wrong, and glad every day that she had sat down in the chair across from his desk that evening in the lamplight and asked about the room, and glad that he had told her the truth about it, that he had not wanted her to arrive somewhere after 900 miles and find that no one had thought to make a proper place for her. She had found the most proper place imaginable. In 1886, the school required its third room, and Dorothy hired a second assistant teacher, and she began thinking about what the students of Caldwell would need in the next decade when they were grown, whether there might be a way to send the best of them on to further education, to universities in the East, and she began writing letters and making inquiries in the way she had always operated, with focused persistence and the willingness to hear no several times before the yes arrived. Henry watched her do this with the expression she knew best on him now, after 8 years of knowing his face as well as she knew her own, the expression that was admiration and love together, that had nothing guarded in it anymore. He had been opening steadily, all the years she had known him, not changing into a different person but becoming more fully himself, the way a landscape becomes more detailed and more beautiful the longer you look at it and the more of its seasons you have seen. The seriousness was still there, the quietness, the preference for doing over saying. But the doing had Dorothy in it now, and the children, and the ranch hands he cared for with the practical loyalty of a man who understood that a life was made of obligations to the people in it, and the smaller ranchers around him whom he dealt with fairly, and the creek in the cottonwoods that he still rode to on June afternoons when he could make the time. She still went with him when the school day was done and the children were occupied. She had never tired of the creek, any more than she had tired of the man who had first taken her there. On a June afternoon in 1887, 9 years after Dorothy Brooks had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell and chased her hat down the main street, and had it handed back to her by a man on a gray horse who could not be bothered to say more than one syllable, she sat with Henry Boone at the edge of the Cottonwood Creek with their feet near the water, James at 10 years old somewhere upstream with a fishing line, and Margaret at 7 gathering the wildflowers that had returned for another season. Blue and orange and yellow against the June grass, and the cottonwood seeds were drifting on the still air above the water the way they always did in June, slow as thought, bright as anything. Henry was looking at the water and she was looking at him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and she saw all the seasons they had shared in his face, the winter of their first year and the summer of their first son, and the long, slow years of building something real together in the Kansas grass. And she saw that he was the same man who had handed her hat back without looking at her, and she was the same woman who had followed it down the dusty street. And they were also entirely other people than those two had been. People made by 9 years of choosing each other daily, in all the ways that a life requires. "I am thinking," he said, "that I had better find a better word than grateful." "Why better?" she asked. "Because grateful is too small," he said. "For this, for you, for all of it." She leaned her shoulder against his and looked at the water, at the cottonwood seeds drifting and the wildflowers on the bank, and James somewhere upstream arguing with his fishing line, and Margaret coming toward them with her arms full of color. "You could try the Spanish," she said. He laughed, low and genuine, and put his arm around her, and Margaret arrived and deposited her entire harvest of wildflowers in her mother's lap, and then climbed into her father's arms. And upstream James shouted something about a fish that turned out, when examined, to be a moderately sized catfish that he was very proud of and that Ada would prepare for supper. The Kansas sky was the wide, extravagant blue above the cottonwoods, and the creek ran clear and quick over its limestone bed. And the life that Dorothy had come 900 miles to find was exactly what it was and everything it had always been, which was more than enough, which was in fact the kind of wealth that you cannot put a number on, and that no drought or hardship or distance can fully diminish once you have it. They stayed by the creek until the light went long and golden across the grass, and then they gathered their children and their fishing and their armful of Kansas wildflowers and rode home through the evening, through the grassland that was theirs and also the world's and also simply itself, which is the truest thing land ever is. And the lights of the ranch came up in the dusk ahead of them, the house Henry had built and kept and never left. The house with the room at the end of the upstairs corridor where the east window caught the morning light, and the life they had made together inside it rose to meet them like the breath of something that has learned over long years to be exactly what it is. The blue and cream quilt was worn soft now from many washings, and Margaret had claimed the small upholstered chair by the bedroom fireplace as her particular reading place, and James had filled the bookcase with his own accumulation of books and small rocks and interesting things found outdoors. And the writing desk still sat under the east window where Dorothy wrote her letters and her lesson plans, and the journal she had been keeping for 9 years. And everything in the room still spoke of the thought that had gone into it, the care of a man who had decided before he knew her that she deserved to be properly welcomed. She had always been properly welcomed. She thought she would spend the rest of her life understanding all the ways that was true. Henry came into the room that evening after the children were settled, and she was at the desk writing in her journal, and he stood behind her and read over her shoulder without embarrassment in the way he had done for years, with the easy intimacy of people who have nothing to hide from each other, and she let him read what she had written. She had written, "This is what I know. That the heart of a person is not always on the surface. That the most important rooms are the ones prepared with care before the guest arrives, because they say the truest thing about the person who made them ready. That a man who hands you your hat and says nothing may be the man who has already made you a home. That love in the wild country is the most practical and the most extravagant thing a person can undertake, and it is worth every mile of every road that brought you to it." Henry read it and was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hands on her shoulders and bent and kissed the top of her head. "Is that what you know?" he said. "That is what I know," she said. "Then you know everything that matters," he said. She turned in the chair and looked up at him. This man she had been wrong about and then right about. This serious and quietly extraordinary person who had loved her in the language of things done, of rooms prepared and chalk boxes and men sent to help in the morning and a creek shown at golden hour and a life made with intention and care, and the deep and abiding attention of a man who, when he loved, loved completely. "Not everything," she said. "I am still learning the Spanish." Henry Boone laughed, and the Kansas night was quiet around the ranch, and the children slept in their rooms, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the Cottonwood Creek ran clear over its limestone bed 2 miles east in the dark, and Dorothy Brooks Boone sat in the room that had been made for her before she arrived and knew herself to be, in every way that mattered in this life or any other, thoroughly, completely, and permanently home.